You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 512 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, at the close of the last episode, it was May 16th, 1864, and the Battle of Resaca had come to an end as the Confederates abandoned their lines, crossed the Oostenaula River, and withdrew off to the south.
The armies found a different landscape south of the Oostenaula. The steep ridges, narrow gaps, and heavy woods that characterized the region north of the river now gave way to more open terrain and gently rolling hills.
In 1864, this area of northern Georgia was a sparsely populated farming region with a few small towns. Except for the iron foundries at Rome and some mills along the Etowah River, it boasted no real industrial resources. When the armies moved into the area, most of the civilians piled their possessions into wagons and sought refuge in places like Marietta and Atlanta.
The all-important Western and Atlantic Railroad crossed the Oostenaula at Resaca and ran south through Calhoun and Adairsville to Kingston, where it met the branch line that stretched west to Rome.
From Kingston, the tracks of the W&A turned to the southeast, passing through Cass Station and Cartersville before crossing the Etowah just north of Allatoona Pass. As the crow flies, the distance from the Oostenaula at Resaca to the Etowah near Allatoona Pass is about 35 miles. As the railroad ran, though, the river-to-river distance was about 45 miles.
After the Confederates abandoned Resaca and withdrew south of the Oostenaula, Joe Johnston expected to find a good defensive position a few miles south of the river near Calhoun, where he could again contest the Yankees' advance.
However, in this expectation, Johnston was soon disappointed because he discovered that if he set up shop there, an inconvenient creek would cut through the center of his lines and make it difficult for the wings of his army to support one another.
Concluding that he therefore had no choice but to continue withdrawing southward, Johnston did just that, hoping that once the rebels reached Adairsville, he could find a suitable defensive position.
By noon on May 17th, advance elements of the Confederates' Army of Tennessee were in Adairsville. As Joe Johnston approached the town, he thought he'd be able to deploy the army across the valley there to block the Federals' route south. With the rebels' flanks protected by the ridges on the sides of the valley in which the town sits, Johnston anticipated offering battle there.
Once again, however, Johnston was disappointed in his expectations. When he reached Adairsville about midday, he quickly discovered that his maps had misled him, because in reality there was too much ground to cover and the valley was too wide to be held, even after Polk's troops arrived by rail and joined the army.
As you guys will recall, although some Confederate reinforcements from Alabama had already joined Johnston's army in Georgia, the Bishop General Leonidas Polk was bringing the rest, and they joined the Army of Tennessee at Adairsville.
Exactly. In any case, as we pointed out previously, Joe Johnston had spent 4 months at Dalton, occupying a position he wasn't confident he could hold. Yet in all that time, he hadn't bothered to survey, either in person or through his staff, the area to the south through which the Army would have to retreat if he gave up Dalton.
Nor, after reaching Resaca, had he made any preparations to establish a new fallback position south of the Oostenaula. In fact, however, it didn't matter, because Sherman could simply have moved down the right bank of the Oostenaula, or to Rome, and flanked any position Johnston occupied north of the Etowah. At any rate, Joe Johnston, disappointed in not finding a line he could occupy at Adairsville, once again studied his maps.
At a conference on the night of the 17th, Hardee argued that even if the terrain wasn't ideal, the Army should nonetheless make a stand at Adairsville. But Johnston decided the withdrawal southward would continue, although he did develop a plan by which he hoped to draw the Yankees into an ambush and destroy a part of their force.
While Joe Johnston sought some position from which he might oppose the Federal advance, William Tecumseh Sherman indulged in his own misunderstanding of the situation, because after the rebels abandoned Dalton, Sherman assumed they wouldn't stop retreating until they were below the Etowah.
It wasn't until late on May 15th, after 3 days of fighting north of the Oostenaula, that Sherman concluded Johnston really intended to battle it out at Resaca.
However, discovering the next morning that the Confederates had slipped away from Resaca during the night, Sherman again jumped to the conclusion that Johnston would race south to put his men below the Etowah as quickly as he could.
And so, believing that the rebels were marching as quickly as possible toward the Etowah, Sherman, on May 16th, spread his own forces across a wide front in pursuit.
George Thomas, with 4th Corps and most of 14th Corps, was to cross the Oostenaula at Resaca and move south along the line of the railroad, directly following the Confederates. John Schofield with 23rd Corps and Hooker with 20th Corps were to cross the Coosawattee above the point where it joined the Conasauga to form the Oostenaula and swing into place on Thomas's left. Meanwhile, James McPherson with the Army of the Tennessee was to cross the Oostenaula at Lay's Ferry and become the western, or right end, of the Federal line.
While those movements were underway, a division from 14th Corps, accompanied by Union cavalry, would move southwest down the right bank of the Oostenaula. They were intended to provide some protection for Sherman's right flank against any rebel strike from the southwest.
That force also offered the Federals the possibility that they might find another spot to cross the river and come in behind the Confederate left flank and threaten the Western and Atlantic.
On May 16th, Thomas and McPherson pushed southward, but their advance was slowed to a crawl by Confederate cavalry commander Joe Wheeler's horsemen, who were acting as the rebel army's rear guard.
Thomas's lead units didn't reach Calhoun, only half a dozen miles below Resaca, until 6 p.m. Meanwhile, off to the northeast, Hooker and Schofield managed to get their columns tangled up and fell to squabbling over rank and right-of-way. Their foolishness delayed the march, and only the leading division of their force had gotten across the Coosawattee by nightfall.
May 17th witnessed a repetition of the events of the previous day. The advance of Thomas's lead units again ground almost to a halt in the face of stiff opposition from the Confederate rear guard, and this resistance convinced Sherman that Johnston intended to make a stand at Adairsville. And so Sherman ordered his widely scattered forces to concentrate there on May 18th, and he expected that he'd then have to fight a major battle to eject the Confederates from the place.
On the 17th, to the west, the Union cavalry crossed the Oostenaula and moved south on the right of Sherman's wide front, while the lone 14th Corps Division that had been sent down the river reached Rome. There it skirmished briefly with the rear elements of Polk's troops, who were rushing through the town to join Johnston at Adairsville. Those rebels were gone from Rome the next morning, and so the Yankees occupied the place without opposition.
When the Yankees occupied Rome, which was a crucial point on the Confederates' line of communication between Georgia and Alabama, the entire line of the Oostenaula was flanked. That meant central Alabama now lay open to a possible federal thrust westward from Rome.
This seems like a good time to note that had Joe Johnston not been so anxious to hurry southward to a new defensive position, he might have found or made an opportunity on the 16th or 17th to strike at one or more of Sherman's widely separated columns. Johnston had a fresh division, Walker's, available, and by using it aggressively, he might have thrown a wrench into the federal pursuit. But doing so doesn't seem to have ever crossed his mind. So launching a jab here at the Federals can be added to the long list of Joe Johnston's missed chances.
When Joe Johnston decided on May 17th that the Confederates wouldn't attempt to make a stand at Adairsville after all, he again turned to his maps to see what might lie to the south.
He noted that from Adairsville, 2 roads led off to Cassville, 10 miles to the southeast. The main route paralleled the railroad south for about 9 miles to Kingston. It then ran east for some 7 miles to Cassville. Those roads formed the legs of a right triangle. Kingston was the right angle, while the longer leg, or the hypotenuse, was the Adairsville-Cassville Road.
Johnston guessed that Sherman would divide his force at Adairsville to facilitate his march south from that town. If Johnston was correct, then part of the federal force would march south to Kingston, while the rest marched southeast directly to Cassville.
And if the Yankees did use both roads, then the rebels might be able to strike one column before the other could come to its assistance. The relatively rough terrain between the 2 roads would make it difficult for the separated federal columns to help each other or even for them to communicate.
When the Confederates marched out of Adairsville that night, Johnston accompanied Polk and Hood down the road to Cassville. Hardee, along with the Army's wagon trains, headed to Kingston. After reaching Kingston, Hardee was to turn east and join Polk and Hood at Cassville. If all went as Johnston planned, his army would then be united and be able to strike at the weaker of the 2 federal columns.
At daybreak on the 18th, the Federals discovered that the rebels had again slipped away during the night. They quickly occupied Adairsville, but didn't immediately pursue the Confederates. Instead, they rested until about noon while waiting for trailing units to come up. After questioning some deserters, Sherman concluded that the rebels were making for Kingston. He therefore directed McPherson's Army of the Tennessee and most of Thomas's Army of the Cumberland toward that town. Then, as Joe Johnston expected, Sherman separated his force by sending Hooker's 20th Corps, followed by Schofield's Army of the Ohio, directly toward Cassville.
When the Federals went into camp about 6 o'clock that evening, Thomas was some 6 miles south of Adairsville. McPherson was a few miles off to the west, around Woodland, while Hooker and Schofield were about 3 miles out of Adairsville on the Cassville Road.
That night, Sherman, still hoping to catch Johnston in the relatively open country north of the Etowah, wrote Schofield, quote, "If we can bring Johnston to battle this side of the Etowah, we must do it, even at the hazard of beginning battle with but part of our forces."
By noon on the 18th, the Confederates were concentrated at the spot Joe Johnston had chosen, along Two Run Creek, just north of Cassville. Johnston placed Polk's corps across the road, blocking the direct route from Adairsville, while Hood held his troops off to the right and a bit south of Polk.
As for Hardee, he'd moved through Kingston and then on east toward Cassville, where he went into position as the left of the Confederate line. With the last of Polk's reinforcements, the infantry division of Samuel French and Jackson's cavalry, having arrived, Johnston's force was at its peak strength, about 75,000 men, and both the Confederate commander and his troops were optimistic about their chances to land a strong blow and give the Yankees a bloody nose come tomorrow.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
Thursday, May 19th was hot and muggy, and for the Confederates of the Army of Tennessee, it turned out to be one of the most frustrating and demoralizing days of the war, which is saying something.
And for later historians, that day would prove to be one of the most confusing of the war, since Joe Johnston and John B. Hood each left a record of the day's 2 controversial events, and it's simply impossible to reconcile their accounts.
If we're to believe Johnston, in the morning he ordered Hood to move out on a country road a mile or so east of the Adairsville-Cassville Road and form his corps for battle, facing west. When Polk engaged the head of the Federals' Hooker-Schofield column, Hood was to attack the Yankees' flank from the east.
However, according to Hood's account, he'd received a report of an isolated enemy force moving south a short distance east of the Adairsville-Cassville Road. He said he requested and received permission from Johnston to take his corps across the fields and attack the Federals. Hood later insisted the attack wasn't Johnston's idea, nor did Johnston instruct Polk to cooperate with him, that is, with Hood.
In any case, whether at Johnston's order or his own initiative, Hood marched his troops out that morning to engage the Federals northeast of Cassville. But after going a short distance, Hood learned of some Yankees off to his right.
Those enemy soldiers constituted a source of potential danger to Hood's column, because if he deployed to carry out his original plan, this new enemy force might fall on his corps' flank or rear. Hood therefore halted and threw out skirmishers who quickly engaged the Yankees.
With the Yankees having thrown an unexpected wrench into his plans, Hood dropped back to again take his place in the Confederate lines next to Polk. A short time after this, Joe Johnston decided his plan to ambush the Yankee column north of Cassville wasn't going to work, so he ordered the army back to a ridge below the town.
When Joe Johnston received Hood's report, he'd expressed disbelief that any Federals were actually off to Hood's right, although he admitted that if they were there, Hood would have been foolish to continue with his original plan. Later, Johnston would insist that no Yankees were in position to menace Hood's flank that morning. However, we now know that they were there. Some Federals from the Hooker-Schofield column had moved to the east, stumbled onto a country road leading into Cassville from the northeast, and in following that route, blundered into Hood's force.
So, with an enemy force of unknown strength off to his right that might threaten his flank or rear, it would have been extremely foolish for Hood to carry on with his original plan. Hood made the right decision to call off his attack and return to the Army's lines.
In any case, it seems unlikely that an attack by Hood would have accomplished much, since by that time, over at the other end of the Confederate lines, Thomas's Federals from the Army of the Cumberland had pushed eastward from Kingston and were in position to confront Hardee's corps on the rebel left, just west of Cassville.
That afternoon, Johnston put the Confederate Army into line on a ridge running from northeast of Cassville to a point about 1.25 miles south of the town. Hood's corps held the right end of the line, Polk's corps the center, and Hardee's corps the left.
The ridge itself seemed to be a strong defensive position, and Johnston, as always, hoped that Sherman would assault it. However, the new rebel position had a serious weakness, and the weakness became apparent during the course of the afternoon. Off to the northeast, Federal artillery batteries set up shop on nearby high ground and soon discovered that some of their pieces could deliver enfilade fire against a portion of Polk's position, at a point where the Confederate line made a slight angle to conform itself to the terrain at that spot.
As y'all will recall, enfilade fire, or fire plunging down the length of a line, was often devastating to the troops subjected to it, and here Polk's men in the enfiladed section of their position spent a very uncomfortable afternoon under the fire of the Federal guns across the way.
That cannon fire was so terrible that when Polk and Hood met with Johnston that night at Polk's headquarters, they stated that the Yankee artillery alone would make it impossible for them to hold their positions the next day. Joe Johnston later wrote that Hood and Polk urged him to withdraw south of the Etowah, and that only after arguing with them for some time did he yield to their pleas.
Johnston claimed that he worried Hood's and Polk's fears would infect the troops, undermine their morale, and make it impossible for the Confederates to hold the position at Cassville.
However, Hood later said that while he and Polk agreed that the position at Cassville was compromised from a defensive standpoint, they did think it would make a good jumping-off point for a Confederate attack. Hood claimed that he and Polk urged Johnston to launch an offensive strike at the Yankees, but the Army commander rejected their suggestion and instead ordered yet another retreat.
Hardee missed the first part of that conference, and when he arrived at about 10 p.m., Johnston had already decided the Army would abandon the position at Cassville. Once again, finding himself left out of the decision-making, a frustrated Hardee voiced his opposition to another withdrawal.
The bitter squabble between Joe Johnston and John B. Hood arose later, when the two had become completely alienated and when each had had a chance to read the other's account of the meeting. But no matter what happened at that conference, or the degree to which Federal artillery enfiladed the ridge position, it's clear with hindsight that the Confederates wouldn't have remained at Cassville on May 20th.
That's because at about the time Hardee joined the conference that night, the generals received word that Yankee troops had gotten possession of a bridge over the Etowah a few miles downriver.
Those Federals were some of McPherson's men who marched from Kingston and captured Woolley's Bridge over the Etowah. So, had the Confederates remained in their Cassville position the next day, the Yankees could simply have come up the left bank of the river and cut them off from Atlanta. In fact, several days later, on May 23rd, Brigadier General M.J. Wright, reporting from Atlanta to Braxton Bragg in Richmond, noted that, quote, "a flank movement of the enemy crossing the Etowah on the left," end quote, had been the reason for Johnston's latest retreat.
In any case, soon after the General's Conference on the night of the 19th broke up, Johnston's staff officers went out to deliver the orders to the Army for the withdrawal from the position at Cassville. The Confederate troops began pulling out of their lines about midnight, but small parties of men were left behind to feed the campfires and make noise so as to deceive the Yankees into believing the army was still present.
In the darkness, as the Confederate soldiers quietly left their lines and slipped away from Cassville, many of them were angry, unhappy, and disheartened by the day's events. They'd been maneuvered out of a very strong position at Dalton, and then fallen back from Resaca and Adairsville. Now, here they were, pulling out of Cassville, and, once again, under cover of the night, running away from the Yankees.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Cassville Affairs, Johnston, Hood, and the Failed Strategy in the Atlanta Campaign, 19 May 1864, by Robert D. Jenkins, Sr.
We've mentioned Jenkins already in connection with the preservation efforts of Save the Dalton Battlefields, but he's also written 3 excellent books on the Atlanta campaign.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find information on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like George B. and Last Angel and Tony P.
and Todd B. and Jason.
We also want to give a shout out to Greg S. for his donation.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.